Detective Jack Miller walked slowly down the abandoned street. Autumn this year seemed strange, unliving. Each step echoed through the empty neighborhoods where no one lived anymore. Once there had been life here, but now it was a ghost town. The wind pulled cool currents of air through the cracks in the old houses, as if the city itself were sighing with exhaustion. Jack inhaled deeply, feeling something invisible hanging over him like a dusty cobweb that wasn't so easy to get rid of. It had been a long time since he'd been able to shake off the feeling that someone was watching him. It had started when his partner, Harper, had died. The whole department knew he'd killed himself, but Jack couldn't believe it. They'd seen too many deaths together and too much suffering for anything to suddenly break the old detective. However, Harper left, leaving only one phrase in a note: "It was always there." That was the beginning of a nightmare that consumed Jack. For the past few months, he had been investigating a series of strange deaths that were so unexplained that even seasoned experts couldn't say anything. Each victim died in inhuman agony. The blood of the victims was spreading on the floor as if it was flowing out of them from their own inner fear. And each time, the same horror remained on their faces. They weren't dying at the hands of the killer, it was the fear itself that scared them. Harper knew something like that, but he never had time to tell it. Late one night, Jack walked into the old bar where he and Harper often had a couple of beers after a hard day's work. There was always a heavy, musty odor in the empty room, as if the place hadn't been ventilated in years. The bartender, a familiar face to Jack, nodded silently at him, slowly wiping down the counter. This place had once been full of voices, drunken laughter, and shuffling heels, but now it seemed like the last refuge of forgotten souls. "Hey, Jack," the bartender wheezed, "you've been wondering about those deaths, haven't you? Everybody's talking, but nobody really knows." Jack was silent. The question was pointless, and the answer would be the same. All he knew was that there was something more behind it. He took the glass and looked at his reflection in the murky glass. Deep wrinkles on his forehead, gray hair poking through his temples. He wasn't the same guy who'd been full of self-confidence a long time ago. The dark circles under his eyes weren't just evidence of fatigue, they spoke of nights when sleep was simply impossible. "You know what this is, right?" The bartender looked at him oddly, tilting his head sideways. "No," Jack answered coldly, taking a sip of his liquor. "I've heard of the Black Terror," the bartender continued. "They say it's a shadow you can't see until it catches up with you. It has no form, no face. It just absorbs your deepest fears and turns them into reality." "Bullshit," Jack shoved the glass away. "A delusional fairy tale for those who can't find answers." But in truth, the anxiety was already humming inside him. Jack remembered the last case, where the victim had literally drowned in her own chair, but no trace of water had ever been found. And another victim who had been burned alive, though there was no sign of fire on the body. Inside, however, it was like a baked potato. It was a fear, a horror that came alive in reality. Tom, his new partner, met Jack at yet another crime scene, the fifth victim in 2 months. They stood in a sullen house where it seemed the walls were about to start whispering their dark secrets to them. "Jack, are you sure you haven't lost your touch? We're already going in circles. No evidence. No motive. These deaths, they just don't make any logical sense. You think it's something supernatural? Do you think it's just a coincidence?" Jack grinned evilly, glancing at the dead man's distorted face. "What, did each of them just die of fright by accident?" "You saw their faces, Tom. They knew what had come for them." Tom fell silent, trying not to look at the body. He hated to admit that Jack might have been right. "We have to do something. Someone has to stop this." Jack lowered his eyes, realizing that this something was coming for each of them. After a week, Jack noticed an oddity. His own dreams had become a battlefield. He dreamed of Harper and the faces of the victims. But they weren't talking to him, they were just watching. Staring and staring at him. All the time. Their eyes were blank, and all he could feel was cold. One night, when Jack woke up again, drenching himself in sweat, he realized he wasn't alone. His apartment was dark, But from the corner of the room where the light had long been missing, a shadow stretched out, unnaturally long and black. It moved slowly, like a snake, stretching until it was right in front of him. The shadow had no face, but it was there. Jack felt its breath icy and invisible. "It's you," Jack could barely get the words out, trying not to breathe. The shadow seemed to freeze, then slowly leaned closer to his ear. It was even colder, and he felt a wave of fear surge through his body like a current through wires. "You're afraid of you, Jack," the shadow whispered in Harper's voice. He froze. It was not a creature that had come from the outside. It had been inside him from the beginning. Suddenly it dawned on him, the creature that embodied fear was only awakening what was already embedded in his mind. Harper knew it, but he couldn't handle it. Jack was next. Jack jumped out of bed, trying to throw off the terror, but the shadow followed him. In the mirror, he saw his own reflection, distorted and empty like all the victims. Blood dripped from his forehead, but it wasn't fear, it was himself, his own self-hatred, his own hell. He couldn't run away from himself. Couldn't hide. Couldn't take refuge anywhere. But then Harper's voice echoed in his head, "Fear only kills if you let it." Jack realized that only he himself could break the cycle. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and said into the emptiness that surrounded him, "You won't take me. I am not yours." The shadow stopped. It disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving him alone in complete silence. Jack opened his eyes, realizing that this was the end, but only for him. There was still something hovering around the city, taking the souls of those who couldn't handle themselves. It was fear, an ancient and omnipresent fear that could not be defeated, but could be lived with if you could find the strength. Fear, it's always been there, but you can't fully feel it until it becomes a part of you. Like an ancient parasite, it crawls slowly through your thoughts, feeding on your weaknesses, drinking up your nightmares, wrapping around your mind and leaving you empty. But it was only now that Jack realized that fear was not the enemy. He's not a villain or a monster. He's just a mirror that shows what's always been inside, what's always lurked beneath the skin. People run from that reflection like fire, not realizing they are running from themselves. The black terror is not just a shadow or a creature that dwells in the dark recesses of the mind. It is something ancient and inescapable, something that has been with humanity since the earliest days of its existence. Jack realized that fear is part of human nature, an unchanging companion. It is much more than just an emotion. It is a kind of dark god that everyone worships without knowing it. A god that bursts out of the deepest depths and makes you feel pain, but in that pain lies the truth about yourself. Jack had long thought that fear had to be conquered. It seemed the most obvious thing to do, fight his way out of its clutches. But now that his own fear had taken shape, had become visible and tangible, he realized that there was no point in fighting. Victory over fear is a lie that weak people feed themselves. After all, you can only defeat something that has boundaries, limits. Fear is limitless. It stretches like an endless darkness inside each person, and it is impossible to escape from it. It is like air, not visible, but always present. And at that moment, standing alone on a dead street, Jack suddenly realized that fear is not something to hide from. On the contrary, fear is something to embrace. It is your companion, your eternal ally in this crazy world. The more you resist, the stronger it becomes. The more you fight, the deeper he penetrates. But when you turn around to face it, look into its bottomless eyes, you realize that it is you. Fear is your shadow, the consequence of all the decisions you didn't make, all the opportunities you turned down. He's you when you hide from your destiny. Jack wondered how many people in this town or any town could realize the same thing. How many of them would continue to run in circles, chasing phantom salvations, empty victories. He remembered the victims, all of them trapped in their own fears. They had seen the monsters that were born from their depths, but not one of them had been able to stop and say, "This is me. This is a part of me." That was their undoing. But Jack was trying to escape, too. Not from the creature, no. From himself. He knew it, but he wouldn't admit it. His fear was deep, like a bottomless abyss, and that abyss reflected all his weaknesses, all his failures, his mistakes, his unresolved issues. He was afraid to admit to himself that this fear had been his only companion all these years. Every time he made a difficult decision, every time he fought a battle with himself, the fear was there. And even though Jack had defeated many external threats, the fear inside grew. It didn't stop. Didn't slow down. Now that he realized it, there was no room left in his heart to fight. Fear is not an enemy. It's an old friend who walks hand in hand with you through life. The question is how you view it, as a burden or as a companion. Jack didn't try to fight anymore. He didn't get stronger or braver. But now he realized that it was okay to be afraid. And that was his major revelation. Fear doesn't kill, only the attempt to deny it does. And those who deny it, who try to run away, lose their minds. Fear is just life as it is, with all its corners, abysses, and nightmares. There is no escaping it. But now, as the wind rumbled between the ruined houses, he felt at peace. Because, after all, fear is just another form of life. Just like light or darkness, like love or death. And like all life, it can't be defeated, it can only be lived. And if you're willing to face what lurks inside, Jack thought, you'll never be truly alone. But how many of us are ready for that? How many are able to break this eternal cycle of fear and realize that, strangely enough, fear is not the enemy. It is the key to self,